In November 2017, a document was signed in Colombo, Sri Lanka's capital, that would become arguably the most cited and the most argued over piece of paper in modern geopolitics. Sri Lanka's government, struggling to service a debt load that researchers have described as self inflicted by multiple consecutive administrations, agreed to lease the port of Hambantota to a Chinese state owned enterprise, China Merchants Port Holdings, for 99 years. 99 years, the same duration as the British lease on Hong Kong. To many Western observers, this was the smoking gun, proof that China had been quietly engineering a global debt trap, lending to poor countries with the explicit intention of seizing strategic infrastructure when they couldn't pay back. To many Chinese officials and a growing number of academic researchers, that reading was exactly wrong. A politically motivated distortion of what was, at its core, a messy bailout negotiated by a desperate government with few alternatives left. Both stories tell us something true about the world China is actually building. Neither story tells us the whole thing. This, ladies and gentlemen, is China's century. The story of how one of the most populous nations on earth remade its economy, rewired global trade, and began reshaping the international order that the United States of America built after the World War II. It is a story with no villains and no guaranteed ending. To understand what China is doing today, you need to understand what China believes happened to it yesterday. In 1820, by most economic historians' estimates, including those of late economic historian Angus Madison, whose data set is the most widely cited reconstruction of the pre-industrial GDP, China and India together accounted for roughly half of global economic output. China alone may have represented somewhere between one quarter and one third of the total world GDP at that particular point. The specific figures are contested by economic historians, but the broad picture is that China was an economic colossus before industrialization and is accepted across this particular literature. Then came what Chinese historians followed by a popular term which was popularized in the early 20th century and later institutionalized under the Chinese Communist Party, called the Beinin Gongqi, the century of national humiliation. Between 1839 and 1945, China was subjected to a series of military defeats, forced treaty concessions, colonial incursions, and occupations that actually went on to leave the Qing dynasty hollowed out and then completely toppled. The Republic of China that replaced it struggled for decades as well, with civil war, Japanese invasion, before itself becoming defeated by Mao Zedong's communist forces in 1949. The People's Republic of China was declared on October the 1st, 1949. Mao's opening words from the Gate of Heavenly Peace was that the Chinese people have stood up. What followed was not some kind of stability. The People's Republic's first 3 decades were turbulent, lethal, and in significant ways self-destructive. The Great Leap Forward of 1958 to 1962 was Mao's attempt to rapidly industrialize through decentralized steel production and agricultural collectivization, and it went on to produce one of the worst famines in recorded history. Historians estimate that the death toll went from anywhere from 15 to 55 million people, depending upon the methodology and the source. The wide range reflects genuine scholarly uncertainty about the demographic data from this particular period. The core fact was a catastrophic mass death resulting from a policy failure which is well established across Chinese, Western, and independent academic sources. The Cultural Revolution of 1966 to 1967 purged intellectuals, dismantled educational institutes, and killed an estimated hundreds of thousands to over a million people through political violence, with an additional significant toll from associated famine and prosecution. Again, precise figures are disrupted, but the scale of destruction is not. By the time Mao died in 1976, China was largely isolated internationally. Its economic primitive by any metric was dead. The per capita income was roughly equivalent to that of something like a sub Saharan Africa. The transformation that followed is one of the most studied events in economic history. Deng Xiaoping, who consolidated power after a struggle following Mao's death, made a decision that broke with the entire Maoist orthodoxy. He would open Chinese economy or China's economy to foreign capital and market mechanisms, selectively controlled but genuinely. The policy known as Gauge Kaifang reform, which is reform and opening up, began formally in 1978. Its initial mechanisms were specific: special economic zones established first in Shenzhen, Zhuhai, Sontu, and Xiamen, where foreign investments, market set prices, and profit incentives were permitted in ways forbidden in the rest of the country. Deng reportedly articulated his pragmatic philosophy in a phrase that has become very famous, and it says it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it catches the mice. What followed was the fastest sustained economic expansion in recorded history. Between 1978 and roughly 2015, China's economy grew at an average annual rate of approximately 9 to 10% per year, a pace sustained for longer than any comparable episode economists have actually recorded. The World Bank, the IMF, and independent researchers uniformly describe this as unprecedented. Over this period, China lifted more people out of extreme poverty than any other episode in any advent of human history. The World Bank estimates that between 1990 and 2015, the number of people in China living below the international poverty line dropped by approximately 800 million. This figure is cited across sources through the methodology for measuring poverty is itself as a subject of ongoing academic debate. Western coverage of China often reaches for one of two framings. Either China is a capitalist economy that happens to have a communist flag, or it's a command economy that happens to have a stock market. Both framings actually miss the mechanism. The correct term, and this is not a framing, is a description used by Chinese economists themselves as well as outside researchers, including economist Barry Nocton at UC San Diego, which is it is a hybrid developmental state, and here is how this exactly works. China's economy has a large private sector. By employment, private sectors account for the majority of urban jobs, the majority of exports, and the majority of innovation output. But that private sector operates within a framework of party state owned power that shapes its incentives, limits, and opportunities in ways that have no precise analog in liberal markets of other economies. China has produced 5 year plans consecutively since 1953 under both Mao and every other subsequent leadership. These are not Soviet style commands, right? They don't tell individual factories how many widgets to produce or how many labors to actually deploy. They are instead a set of national priority signals combined with specific investment targets, regulatory guidance, and evaluation metrics for any provincial offices. The 14th 5 year plan, adopted in 2021, identified 7 strategic industries for priority development: next generation information technology, biotechnology, new energy, new materials, high end equipment, new energy vehicles, and aerospace. What the observable outcome has been is in several of these sectors, notably new energy vehicles and solar panels, China has achieved dominant global market share with remarkable speed. At the core of China's economic apparatus sits the state owned enterprises, also called as the SEOs. As of the mid 2020s, China's SEOs accounted for roughly a quarter to a third of total industrial output. But they are dominant in specific strategic sectors only, like banking or energy, telecommunications, defense, and infrastructure. Long termism is not synonymous with correctness. This point deserves to be should throw some light on and some emphasis, because it is often underweighted in commentary that treats Chinese planning as inherently superior to the Western quarterly earnings thinking, right? Chinese state planning has produced catastrophic failures alongside its massive success as well, and it's very important to acknowledge and discuss this in detail. The Great Leap Forward was a planning failure of lethal proportions. The real estate bubble that built up in Chinese private property sector through the 2010s, driven significantly by parts of local government financing and other institutional vehicles which actually used land sales to fund debt, represents what economists broadly describe as the largest real estate bubble in modern history by aggregate value. Though the precise magnitude of this is disrupted, the collapse of the Evergrande Group, which carried over $300 billion in liability at its peak, was not an accident but a product of a system that directly directed enormous capital towards politically favored sectors without adequate risk planning and risk pricing. China's zero COVID policy, maintained from 2010 2020 until its abrupt reversal in December 2022, had significant economic costs. The IMF and independent economists estimated GDP losses relative to the trend. The specific figures are disrupted, but the direct impact was a measurable negative effect on growth, particularly in the year 2022, which is established across multiple analyses. The lesson is not that Chinese planning doesn't work, right? The lesson is that it works in some domains, fails in others, and that the political incentive structure in which bad news travels slowly upwards towards a hierarchy that punishes the bearer and actually goes on to create some kind of systematic blind spots. In 2010, China overtook the United States to become the world's largest manufacturer by output. By the mid 2020s, China accounts for approximately 28 to 30% of global manufacturing output. How did this happen? The Special Economic Zone model, pioneered in Shenzhen, was a deceptively simple in design, carve out of a geographical area, declare it subject to different rules, and let the experimentation run. In the SEZs, foreign companies could establish operations, repatriate profits, and operate with reduced regulatory burden. Chinese workers streaming from the countryside under relaxation of the household registration system provided labor at a fraction of what manufacturers paid in countries like Japan and Taiwan. By the 1990s, Shenzhen alone had attracted billions of dollars of foreign direct investment and was producing a significant share of the world's consumer electronics. The specific figures vary by source and year, but the transformation from agricultural country to manufacturing megacity within 2 decades is documented through World Bank data, academic studies, and also Chinese government statistics. The conditions in those factories were long hours, dormitory living, limited labor rights, are all part of the story and shouldn't be ignored. Whether those conditions represented exploitation of workers or a ladder of an essential ladder for people to come out of rural poverty or both is genuinely an empirical question that economists and labor sociologists continue to debate with evidences present on both sides. No aspect of China's industrial rise has generated more controversy in Washington, Brussels, and Tokyo than the question of technology transfer. Here is the allegation. In its strongest form, as a condition of market access, Chinese authorities, through regulatory requirements, joint venture mandates, and informal pressure, systematically required foreign countries to share proprietary technology, manufacturing processes, and intellectual property. Here is the counter argument. In its strongest form, every successful late industrializer in history, including the United States in the 19th century, Japan in the post-war period, and South Korea in the 1970s to 80s, pursued aggressive technology acquisition strategies. The US in the 1800s routinely violated British patents and actively recruited British skilled workers. China's manufacturing dominance is not simply about low wages, a point that becomes more important as Chinese wages have risen substantially over the past 2 decades. The more durable competitive advantage is supply amalgamation, right? a producer of consumer electronics in Shenzhen can source components from hundreds of specialized suppliers within a few hours of drive. COVID 19's supply chain disruptions made the dependency very real for Western economies, and it actually accelerated a political push to diversify manufacturing away from China to countries like Vietnam, India, and Mexico. Whether the diversification succeeds at scale and over what time frame will this shift completely take place remains an open question that a lot of people are still answering to today's date. In 2013, Xi Jinping announced what would become the most ambitious infrastructure initiative in modern history, the Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI. The BRI encompasses the Chinese official count agreements with over 140 countries, estimated of total Belt and Road Initiative lending and investment vary enormously from roughly about $400 billion to $1 trillion in commitments between 2013 and 2023, depending on what categories of lending and investment are counted. What Chinese policy documents say is that the Belt and Road Initiative is a development which is a financial initiative aimed at building connectivity like ports, roads, railways, energy infrastructure in developing countries that face significant infrastructure gaps while creating economic opportunities for Chinese firms and workers. What outside researchers and governments actually allege about the intent is that the interpretations range from a genuine development initiative with significant commercial motivations to a deliberate geostrategic tool designed to create economic dependencies that translate into political influence. What the observable outcomes have been is a highly variable debate across countries and projects, which is why the case study is discussed so widely across countries and different continents. On December 3rd, 2021, the Laos-China Railway opened a 1,035-kilometer high-speed line connecting the Chinese border at Botin to Vientiane, the Laos capital. Laos is one of the poorest and the most landlocked countries in Southeast Asia. Its GDP before the railway completion was roughly about 18 to 19 billion dollars. The railway cost approximately $6 billion to construct, out of which roughly 3.5 to 4 billion dollars were funded by Chinese state loans to a joint venture company. By lower tier and independent assessments, the railway has delivered real benefits. Journey time between these two spots dropped from a multi-day road trip to under a few hours, like 4 hours for example. Tourism increased from China, right, and it was substantially the railway's first full years of operation, and it was able to yield great results. The serious caveat noted by researchers at Aid Data and the IMF was that the debt burden on Laos is significant relative to the size of the economy. A Laotian government official might look at the railway and see infrastructure that was genuinely transformative, but an IMF economist might look at the same railway and see a loan extended at a term to a fragile economy couldn't very comfortably absorb. Both observations can be simultaneously true. Back to where we started, Hambantota. Let's establish what is not contested. In 2007, Sri Lanka under President Mahinda began developing this particular port, right? And he was from the Hambantota district, and critics actually called it vanity infrastructure. Funding came from Export-Import Bank of China at commercial interest rate, not concessional development rates, and the port, when completed, generated very minimal commercial traffic. Sri Lanka's total debt from 2015 to 16 had become completely unsustainable. So in 2017, facing a debt crisis, the Sri Lankan government negotiated the 99-year lease period of the Hambantota Port to China Merchants Port Holdings in exchange for $1.12 billion. The debt tap narrative that followed was for several years treated as established fact in Washington's policy circles and much more of Western media. China lends unsustained debts, waits for defaults, seizes its strategic assets, and then researchers started testing the narrative empirically. There was a researcher who had spent decades studying Chinese development finance in Africa and Asia, and who is sympathetic to Chinese state style narratives. He actually published an analysis specifically examining the Hambantota case, and her or his findings was that the evidence for a deliberate, pre planned debt strategy is weak. The lesson of the Hambantota is not China builds debt traps. The evidence doesn't support that as a systematic program. The distinction between predatory design and negligent lending matters, but either way, the loans can become traps. The standard gauge railway in Kenya, the SGR, is one of the most debated Belt and Road Initiative projects in Africa. Phase 1, connecting Nairobi to the port of Mombasa, a distance of about 480 kilometers, opened in 2017. On the positive side, the railway reduced the transmit time for goods between Mombasa and Nairobi from over 30 hours to roughly 8 hours. On the negative side, the SDR had become a precedent financial drain on the Kenyan government. A Kenyan parliamentary committee also published a report in 2019 and found that the loan agreement included clauses that restricted Kenya's ability to use national assets, including in some interpretations, Kenya Ports Authority's revenues as actual collaterals. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the CPEC, is also a Belt and Road Initiative project that most clearly cannot be understood within its geopolitical context. The CPEC is a roughly 3,000 kilometer network of infrastructure projects, which is roads, railways, pipelines, energy facilities, and the deep water port at Gwadar, connecting Kashgar in China's Xinjiang region to Gwadar on the Arabian Sea coast of Balochistan. India wanted CPVC with particular concern as the route passes through Pakistan administered Kashmir territory and India actually claims it as its own. Total announced investment was approximately $62 to $65 billion, though the realized disbursement is significantly lower and disputed as to actual amounts. The Gwadar port, like Hambantota, has attracted far less commercial shipping traffic than originally projected. CPEC remains in progress. It is simultaneously a genuine infrastructure initiative, a geopolitical statement, and a financially complicated arrangement that has required multiple rounds of renegotiation between Chinese and Pakistani officials. No area of US China competition is more consequential or more frequently discussed or oversimplified than technology. The single phrase China is winning the tech race is as misleading as China is losing the tech race. The actual picture is a sector by sector scenario, and these sectors all tell very different stories. In electric vehicles, China has achieved genuine global leadership by any measure. As of 2023-24, Chinese automakers led by BYD and SAIC and a cluster of newer entrants account for the majority of global electric vehicles production and sales anywhere in the world. BYD also went on to overtake Tesla in global EV sales volume in the year 2023. China also dominates the upstream supply of chain for the electric vehicles battery. CATL, the Ningbo-based battery manufacturer, holds approximately 35 to 40% of the global EV market share by capacity. Semiconductors present the mirror image of the EV story as well, because Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company TSMC manufactures the world's most advanced logic chips. TSMC's leading edge nodes 3nm and now 2nm in production are not producible by any Chinese manufacturer. China's most advanced domestic foundry, which is the SMIC, has demonstrated capacity and capability at approximately 7nm, a gap of multiple technology of generations behind the global frontier. US export controls significantly tightened in October 2022 and expanded substantially, have sought to prevent China from acquiring equipment needed to advance, specifically targeting ASML's extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, without which manufacturing at leading edge nodes is currently not possible. Artificial intelligence is the sector where the competition is most genuinely close and where the assessment depends on what you're actually measuring. By a number of AI research papers published and by some citation metrics, China has either the top or the second producer globally in recent years, trading leadership with the United States of America. Huawei's story deserves its own documentary. In brief, the company built the leading 5G equipment portfolio, which was also banned from many Western markets amid allegations that it posed national security threats through potential access of Chinese intelligence services, and has substantially been subject to sweeping US chip export restrictions. The security allegations against Huawei represent a case where evidentiary categories matter enormously. Western governments allege that Huawei's equipment could provide Chinese intelligence services across the network traffic. The observable evidence for specific backdoors in production equipment has not actually been publicly discussed or disclosed in detail, but that would allow some independent assessment to carry out. Taiwan is the most dangerous flashpoint in the contemporary of geopolitics. It requires the most careful treatment. Let's establish the facts, then the competing interpretations, then what we don't know. Taiwan is a self-governing democracy of approximately 23 million people with its own government, military, currency, and foreign relations. In practice, if not in formal international recognition, the People's Republic of China claims Taiwan as an inalienable part of Chinese territory, a claim rooted in the unresolved Chinese Civil War of 1945 to 1949. The United States maintained official relationships with the PRC while simultaneously maintaining unofficial but substantive relationships with Taiwan and providing arms and sales under the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979. What US policy says is that the US acknowledges deliberately ambiguous verb of China's position that there is only one China and Taiwan is a part of it without endorsing that position. The US has maintained strategic ambiguity about whether it would militarily defend Taiwan or not. What Xi Jinping has publicly said is that the Taiwan's reunification with the mainland is not historically necessary, and Xi has not renounced the use of force anywhere. Now, the strategic layer that actually makes Taiwan singular in modern geopolitics is TSMC, a single company headquartered in Taiwan which goes on to manufacture approximately 90% of the world's most advanced logic semiconductors. The chips TSMC produces are inside virtually every high-performing computing device on Earth: smartphones, servers, artificial intelligence training hardware, advanced weaponry system. No country, not the United States, not China, not Japan, has a domestic alternative to TSMC at the leading edge. This creates a situation that strategists describe as the Silicon Shield, the argument that Taiwan's indispensability to global technology supply chain creates a deterrent against military action, because any serious disruption to Taiwan's semiconductor fabs would actually impose a catastrophic cost on the global economy, including China's own technology industry itself. What we don't know: Chinese leadership's actual calculus on Taiwan, their assessment of military readiness, their internal timelines, if any, and whether the United States of America would in fact intervene militarily. Responsible journalism must acknowledge that the most important variables in this scenario are not knowable from open sources. For years, analysts have predicted and Chinese policymakers have worked toward a world where the renminbi challenges the US dollar's dominance in global finance. The gap between aspiration and current reality is significant and does deserve some honest treatment. As of 2024, the US dollar accounts for approximately 58 to 60% of the global foreign exchange reserves, down from roughly 70% 2 decades ago, but still the most dominant reserve currency by a wide margin. The euro is considered second at roughly about 20%. The Chinese yuan approximately accounts for 2 to 3% of global reserves. In SWIFT tracked global payments, the dollar similarly dominates. The yuan's share of global SWIFT payments has grown, but from a very small base, and as of 2024 remains in low single digit percentages. China has built infrastructure to reduce dollar dependency, right? They've built infrastructures like the cross-border interbank payment system, which provides an alternative to the SWIFT for yuan-dominated transactions. They've done currency swap agreements with dozens of central banks, an effort to actually go ahead and price oil and commodity contracts in yuan. They've also gone ahead and done bilateral trade agreements with partners like Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Brazil involving Yuan settlement. The mechanism limiting RMB internationalization is important to understand because it's not primarily a geopolitical problem or a geopolitical issue. It's actually an economic design choice. A truly international reserve currency requires what all economists call capital account openness, the ability to foreign investors to freely move money in and out of Chinese assets. Chinese capital accounts remains substantially controlled by its own government. The honest summary, the dollar's global reserve role is eroding at margins, but a genuine RMB challenge to dollar dominance would require some very major structural changes to China's financial system, and that China's government has so far chosen not to make. So, ladies and gentlemen, the conclusion is the dollar still remains the default. Let's resist the temptation to treat US China comparison as a sporting event, right, with a scoreboard, because that's what I've seen every other influencer do. Both systems have genuinely structural advantages. Both face serious structural vulnerabilities as well. Understanding the difference matters more than declaring a winner. China has built the world's largest speed rail network, over 40,000 kilometers as of 2023, more than the rest of the world combined. China graduates more engineers and STEM PhDs than any other country in the world. The quality distribution is debated, but sheer volume matters, and China is clearly a winner. China's manufacturing infrastructure and supply chain depth, as discussed earlier, represent a structural competitive advantage in physical production that cannot be mismatched by any other alternative. China's saving rate, historically among the highest in the world, has provided a domestic capital pool that funds investment without having the dependency for any other external or foreign financing. China faces one of the most severe demographic challenges of any major economy. Here's why. The one-child policy enforced from roughly 1980 to 2015 produced a population and a structure that is now aging rapidly. China's working age population peaked at around 2011. By the 2040s and 2050s, China will face a ratio of elderly dependents to working age adults that economists project will create substantial fiscal pressure on pension and healthcare systems that are existing in the country. China's total fertility rate has fallen well below replacement to approximately 1 to 1.1, among the lowest in the world, despite removal of the one-child policy and financial incentives for larger families. This demographic trajectory is locked in for decades regardless of policy changes. The real estate sector, which at its peak accounted for somewhere between 20 to 30% of China's GDP by some measure, including upstream industries, has undergone a significant contradiction. The Evergrande crisis was a symptom of a systematic overbuilding and over-leveraging in a sector that served simultaneously as an investment vehicle, local government revenue source, and household wealth store. Whether China's economic growth rate has structurally shifted to a lower gear, which is the middle class income trap question, is actively debated among economists, and China's official GDP growth targets remain in the 5% range. Whether actual growth matches the particular report figures is something that needs to be discussed, but with researchers including Wei Chin at the Brookings Institute suggest that official figures may overestimate or overstate growth in some years. This is the paradox this documentary keeps circling back to. A country that built the world's largest high-speed rail track network that graduates more engineers than any nation on earth, that turned a fishing village into a manufacturing megacity within 2 decades, is the same country facing a demographic collapse that no policy reversal can undo, a real estate sector still working through the largest overbuilt in modern history, and a growth model whose next chapter even its own economists aren't particularly certain of. Long-termism is not synonymous with correctness. That's true of Great Leap Forward, and it's true of whatever comes next. China's strengths are real and so are its fractures. Neither cancel the other one out. Return to November 2017. To Hambantota, the port sits there still mostly quiet. Commercially, it has not transformed into the hub its business case actually promised. Sri Lanka is still recovering from the catastrophic 2022 economic crisis, the worst in its post-independence history, that forced it to default on external debt and seek International Monetary Fund's assistance. The 99-year lease of a strategic port in the Indian Ocean, whatever its origins, is now a fact. Whatever the intent, the outcome has strategic weight. That reality exists regardless of whether it was planned, emergent, or somewhere in between. China's rise is the most subsequential and the most consequential economic story of the 21st century. It is a story about what happens when the world's oldest continuous civilization, after a century of genuine humiliation and several decades of self inflicted catastrophe, decides to reassert itself with a billion workers, a unified state apparatus, and a patient strategy stretching across for generations. It is also a story about limits, about the gap between a government's ambition and its execution, about how a country can lift 800 million people out of poverty and still be racing against its own demographic clock. It is a story that is not finished. The port at the Hambantota was built to handle the traffic of a rising world. The traffic hasn't arrived yet. Whether it does and on whose terms is the question this century will be waiting for the answer.